prior president, President Biden, I think took some very important strategic steps towards solidifying an enduring relationship with India. You couldn't have had a better partner than President Joe Biden. He actually queued up, a relationship for Donald Trump, for this president now, to sort of take with and run. And instead of doing that, he's essentially tanked it in less than 1 year. Certainly, it is correct to say that Trump's erratic behavior and his reckless foreign policy style has finally backfired, with regards to the U.S. India relationship. I think what it shows is, the failure of Trump's, failed brand of foreign policy was on full display.
So the news story that has dominated headlines in India for the last couple of months has been the breakdown in the relationship between India and the United States. It's a breakdown that affects everything from the trade relationship to the strategic partnership between India and the United States. Joining me now on the Hindustan Times podcast is the Congresswoman from California, Sydney Kamlager-Dove, who was really one of the first representatives in the House of Representatives to come out and really talk about the damage that was being done to the India-US partnership and her concerns about the Trump administration's handling of the relationship with India. Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove, thank you so much for joining me here on HT. Could you begin by telling us a little bit about your concerns? You were, like I said, one of the first representatives in Congress to come out and talk about what was happening in the India-US relationship. You expressed your concerns about the Trump administration's handling of India. Why did you choose to do that? And what do you think about where we are right now in our relationship?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. This is such a humbling experience to be able to talk to you and all of your viewers and readers and listeners. I represent the 37th Congressional District in Los Angeles. We have a very large South and Central Asian diaspora community. Artesia is home to, I think, one of the largest Indian American communities, and I have a number of folks in my district as well. And I also serve as ranking member on the South Central Asia Subcommittee on Foreign Affairs. So I'm the highest ranking Democrat. I joined the Foreign Affairs Committee because I think that diplomacy is an incredibly important soft power tool that we have used in the past quite successfully. And hopefully we have an administration that understands its value and will try to use it again. We have endured a very long-standing and positive relationship with India. We have withstood bumps in the road, but we've had administrations that really see and value the relationship with India. And in fact, our prior president, President Biden, I think took some very important strategic steps towards solidifying an enduring relationship with India, inviting Modi to speak. We made strategic developments around technology with the Quad, with AI, with defense tech. I mean, you couldn't have had a better partner than President Joe Biden. He actually queued up, a relationship for Donald Trump, for this president now, to sort of take with and run. And instead of doing that, he's essentially tanked it in less than 1 year. I don't want to sugarcoat it, so I'm telling you the truth. And so, unfortunately, there's a lot of rebuilding that has to happen because this president and the Republican Party view foreign policy through an isolationist lens rather than understanding the importance of culture, the importance of diplomacy, the soft powers that we can use, understanding how to use tariffs and trade agreements much more diplomatically than what they've been doing. And what we have seen as a result of this isolationist and really erratic behavior driven by ego is that the Indian American community has suffered. Our immigrant communities have suffered. Our standing around the world has suffered in just 7 months. And I have an obligation to say that, just like I have an obligation to talk about the enduring relationship between the United States and India and how we have to work even harder to repair the damage that Donald Trump has done.
Congresswoman, you mentioned very rightly that you are the senior Democrat on the subcommittee on Central Asia and South Asia, which basically handles the relationship with India as well. The sense in India has become that the reason why the relationship has gone off the rails is because Donald Trump seems to be annoyed about the fact that India has not nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize, has not credited him for the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. There's also this sense that there may be something more sordid at play here with Pakistan purchasing influence and access to the Trump administration through the Trump family's business dealings. And that has contributed significantly to a lot of public anger in India when it comes to the Trump administration. You are like I said, the ranking member on the House committee that handles South Asia. When you talk to your colleagues and just your own reading of this, is that a reading that makes sense, that these are the reasons why the relationship has gone off the rails? Are we correct in thinking that?
Well, certainly it is correct to say that Trump's erratic behavior and his reckless foreign policy style has finally backfired, with regards to the U.S. India relationship. I mean, look, this is a president that announces fake bilateral agreements on Truth Social. This is a president who is calling around asking people to nominate him for a peace prize. This is a president who doesn't understand cultural sensitivities and dynamics, who doesn't actually care about history. This is a president that actually doesn't understand and fails to utilize the diplomatic tools. This is a president who defunded USAID, that doesn't care about disaster relief. This is a president who has defunded Voice of America. All of these things are elements of diplomacy and soft power. And there are also things that former presidents and members of Congress have worked to start, nurture, develop, and grow painstakingly, over the course of 78 years with India. And so, as I said, it has backfired. And I think, we all have an obligation to kind of talk about the unintended consequences and the repercussions. There is no reason why, our young people, great talent from India who are interested in coming to our colleges and universities, to help with innovation and research should be punished just because they are Indian. There's no reason why arbitrary tariffs should be, tacked onto a country because somebody's ego was hurt. Because these have enormous repercussions, not just for our own bilateral relationship, but for economies and also how we navigate, future tensions or conflicts if they arise.
Congresswoman, could I also ask you, you said that Donald Trump's foreign policy has backfired. Something that we're seeing increasingly is Prime Minister Modi's visit to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that image of him holding hands with Vladimir Putin, standing alongside Xi Jinping of China, that finally seems to have woken up much of the strategic establishment and the media establishment in Washington that, okay, this is something that is approaching a crisis point at this point in time. Could I ask you, what is the temperature in Washington right now? You've come back from recess, you're meeting your colleagues. What is the temperature about the Prime Minister's visit to China? What are you talking about in the hallways of Congress?
No. Well, unfortunately and unrelated, we're actually talking about the continued cover-up with the Epstein files and how there seems to be two sets of laws, one for those in power with lots of money and another set of laws for everyone else. But as it relates to your specific question, I think what it shows is, the failure of Trump's, failed brand of foreign policy was on full display. You see how he, is soft on his adversaries, but cruel to his partners. And I think we just have to let that sit right there. How do you treat your friends and how do you treat your adversaries? I would tell you that if I were president, that's not how I would be doing things.
Could you tell us a little bit about where you think we go from here? Because there is a public mood in India that has turned very militant, I might say, strongly opposed to the Trump administration that ties the hands of the Modi government back home in India. There's also, of course, the president of the United States, who's dug his heels in and said that he sent out people like Peter Navarro and, of course, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, to sort of say that, look, India can have the tariffs cut down, but it will need to stop purchasing Russian energy. And the way that India has been talked about by certain members of the Trump administration has really, really rubbed the Indian public the wrong way. So the question is, where do we go from here? If you were president, or if you were to advise the powers that be, if I could ask you for a three-step process of how we get out of the crisis that we find ourselves in.
Well, no shade, but if I were president, I would not, have gold chandeliers all throughout the White House and then get rid of the Rose Garden. But the other thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't be a bully to my partners and my strategic allies. I think, as someone both from California, and a representative in Congress of the United States, we have great opportunities in front of us with India. I think a lot about Hollywood and Bollywood and ways that we can, partner, not just culturally, but economically. As I mentioned, how are you addressing visas? How are you addressing immigration? How are you making sure that you are wooing the kind of talent that we want in order to make, our businesses much more competitive? Because we also know that when those businesses grow, they're looking to invest in other countries. And there is an economic cycle that we want to nurture. I think something that I actually care very deeply about is sports diplomacy, and how do we lean into that? My city will be hosting one of the World Cup games, and also we will be host to the Olympics. I had the opportunity to go to a cricket tournament over the weekend in Los Angeles, and boy, oh boy, I mean, the second most loved and watched sport in the world. And how do we use soft power like sports diplomacy to build bridges? I will tell you that when I was there with, folks who were from Sri Lanka, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, and from India. And everyone was really focused on the ball and who was going to win. It's a great way to build connection and to use that to allow, sometimes adversaries, but maybe friends that have a little tension to come to the table and talk about things that to find common ground. I do think, I would say no to arbitrary temper tariffs because it's hurting foreign relationships abroad, but it's also hurting American businesses back home. And that's something that we have to talk about. The stance on immigration, and I certainly support border security, but I also recognize that not everyone who is an immigrant should be treated equally. And we have young people who are trying to come over here that are being punished because of the color of the skin or the dialect in their voice. I also think we need to look at who this president is nominating. I mean, we have someone he just put up for nomination to be the ambassador to India. I don't think that person is a friend to the Indian community, and that's very important. Who you are putting forth to be your representative for another country speaks volumes to how you value that country. So there's a lot of work that this administration should be doing. And I will also say that there's a lot of work that this Republican Congress needs to be doing. There have been resolutions that are available that speak to the tariffs. Republicans have been silent. Republicans have been silent when we have talked about the cruelty of the immigration policy, to the defunding of USAID, to the dismantling of Voices of America. If you're going to expand the question, to look at the region, we're talking about disaster relief in Pakistan. No Republican is talking about that. You're talking about Afghans that are stuck in a facility that will be, repatriated back to Afghanistan and probably, killed by the Taliban. No Republican is really talking about that. So we have an obligation. And if I were president, since that was the question, I would recenter on the importance of the region. And I would also be very sensitive to the relationships that each country has with its neighboring countries. You have to respect the history and the sensitivities and lean in when you are asked. Be a friend rather than a bully to the tensions and the conflicts that are happening.
Right. You mentioned, I think you've given me a good segue into my next question, which was on the question of Pakistan and the Trump administration's handling of this. Now, you talked about President Biden, and President Biden was definitely someone who maintained an arm's length relationship with Pakistan, did not really speak with any Pakistani leader during his 4 years in office as president. The Trump administration seems to have reversed that policy, and that is definitely causing some consternation in New Delhi. From your sense on the subcommittee that handles South Asia, what is Washington's view on the partnership with Pakistan? There's a lot of conversation about counterterrorism, critical minerals. Where is this partnership going exactly?
So, as you mentioned, I am ranking member on South Central Asia. And I will tell you that when last Congress, every other week, we had a hearing on South Central Asia. This Congress, we've had not one. So I would tell you that there seems to be zero interest from this Republican Congress, and from this administration to talk about the very serious issues that we're facing with the region in South Central Asia. To your point, issues around, maritime, strategic positioning, critical minerals, energy, tech, a strengthening of the Quad. Those are conversations that we should be having. I will tell you, not only have there been zero hearings on the region, but in fact, we did have a roundtable, which is an informal session, and it was bipartisan. And not one Republican raised issues that are plaguing our relationship with the Quad. I was the only member, actually, who was honest about what this administration is doing as it relates to all of the partners. And they were not good examples that I was raising. Arbitrary taxes, cutting off visas, not providing disaster relief, going back on a word, not having qualified individuals in place at the State Department and in other departments to answer the questions and to be there when the recurring issues and challenges that we know our partner countries face, must be dealt with. I think that's very important that we hold this administration, that we hold, Donald Trump accountable to an erratic foreign policy that does show disregard, for the region.
Right. Let me ask you two final questions, and Congresswoman. One is something that I mentioned to you before we started this interview, which is that you've mentioned that the Republican Party has, generally maintains its distance from talking about South Asia issues. In fact, when I talk to Republican staffers, they say that, look, the big man has spoken. There's very hard for us to now come down and say something on the U.S. India relationship until this immediate crisis is resolved. But it's also true that on the Democratic Party, with the honorable exception of yourself and maybe now California Governor Gavin Newsom and now Ro Khanna as well, there have been fewer senior leaders that have come out and expressed any level of concern about what has been happening over the last couple of weeks. The people that I speak to on the Democratic Party side say that, look, we're in a bind. We have backed tougher measures against Russia. And so if the tariffs are on India for purchasing oil from Russia, it's hard for us to maneuver into a position where we want an exception to be made for India. Could you speak about that? I understand the Republicans have their compulsions, but the Democratic Party, with the exception of yourself and a few people, has also seemed to be reasonably silent on this issue. What's going on there?
Well, what's going on is that Democrats are not in power. And so that question, I think, should really consistently be asked of Republicans. They are in the majority, in the Senate, in the House, and in the White House. So I'm sorry, no disrespect, but they're the ones that people should be asking these questions to, and they should be giving you the answers. Why are they silent? Why is the party in power silent? I'm speaking out because I care. I care about diplomacy. I care about the utilization of soft power. And there are Democrats who are speaking out. But of course, we also have a president that sucks all the energy out of the room and commands and demands the attention be forced on him. What is I think really disturbing and shameful is that, a lot of folks, he sold some goods and he is not delivering on those goods. And a lot of people, even folks in other countries, thought, well, I think that this person is going to be right for my country. And he has proven to be erratic and, in fact, a bad investment for other countries around the world. And I cannot tell you how many meetings I have had with representatives from other countries who've said, we're in a pickle. And my response is, be as courageous, as I am and speak up. Because if you're silent, no one will hear you and you will continue to get walked on. But speaking up about about the challenges with the Quad, the person who spoke up was a Democrat. Moving forward with resolutions against these arbitrary tariffs have been Democrats. Calling out some of the hypocrisies with immigration and how arbitrary and inconsistent the behaviors have been from the White House. Those are coming from Democrats. So I would say we are speaking out, but no one is really hearing us because the megaphone coming from the White House is much bigger. But the silence you should be focusing on is the silence coming from Republicans.
Understood. Congresswoman, my last question to you is that there is increasingly a sense, or it is being talked about increasingly, that a lot of this is also leading into domestic politics, which is that the Trump administration has been talked about among some groups that, in fact, the MAGA movement is finding that it is politically convenient, expedient, and popular in some cases to attack the Indian American community, to sort of talk about Indians coming in tech jobs, Indians dominating the H-1B visa system. And there is very much a sense that the Indian American community has become this tall poppy that has become conspicuous by its success and is now a target for right wingers. We've seen this from conservative commentators like Laura Loomer. Charlie Kirk said something a little while ago on Twitter as well that has gone viral. And there's this increasing sense that actually we're heading into a direction where the India-US relationship will become very political in America because the conservative movement has seized on this idea of Indian Americans being a target. So your view of that?
Well, someone should place a call to J.D. Vance and ask him to speak up on this issue, given his intimate relationship with India. That's all I'm going to say about him. It is unfortunate that we are seeing a rise in political violence and racism and in xenophobia. As an African-American woman, this is not surprising to me, but it is always unfortunate. And the MAGA movement is incredibly phobic. And they have denigrated the term diversity. And I don't know about you, but when I go to a restaurant, I want a diverse menu. When I am going to take classes at a school, I want a diverse curriculum, right? When I am looking at how to earn money and I want to put my money into a portfolio, I want a diverse portfolio. So we, as a country, should be celebrating the power of diversity. Because there's much to be learned, I will share, I was watching a program about the Titans, the American Titans, and there was a businessman who wanted to build the best airplane he could. And he went to a university and he found the best student that he could. And that student came from another country. We should be talking about how to be the best. And look for the most qualified and support those with the greatest talents. And to be agnostic about this kind of, well, not to be agnostic, but to not support the kind of fear that has infected the MAGA party, or maybe part of the brand of MAGA. I was in a hearing in Foreign Affairs and we asked about this. I asked about this exact thing. And the witness said, you could put every American in every college across the country, and you would still need international talent to make the company successful. So we have to re-educate, our communities about H-1B visas. We need to educate folks about how many companies actually use them, and why they use them. We need to have deeper conversations about the importance of diversity in our colleges and universities, because the faculty will tell you why it's so important. The administrators will tell you why it's so important. But I also think that's why it's important for a Black woman from Los Angeles to be talking about these issues. When I'm in my district, I am not trying to divide by color or by language or by country. I am trying to find human connection. I have a South Central Asian Advisory Committee, and I have folks from across the region that sit on it. And we talk about how to build bridges. We talk about how to build connections. We talk about how to make sure that folks are able to find employment. We talk about immigration and profiling and discrimination and how to fight against all of those, from folks from the diaspora. So that's what I'm talking about, because I see the value. And I also see the fear that is in the eyes of many folks from the Indian community. And we have to speak it. We have to talk about it and stand up to it. And that also means standing up to many of our colleagues, my colleagues that are in Congress, that are on the other side of the aisle, who remain silent about all of these things that are impacting your community.
Understood. Congressman Sydney Kamlager-Dove, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us here on the HD podcast about the India-US relationship, your work in Congress. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and I hope that you will invite me back.